The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried in on the same silver tray that carried the household's ordinary correspondence, and yet it was, from the moment the footman set it down, entirely unlike anything else upon it. It bore a seal Sophia Wren had not seen in 11 years, not since she was a girl of 8, standing in the doorway of a small Devonshire farmhouse, watching her mother press that same crest into wax with hands that trembled, though her mother had never once told her why. She did not open it at the breakfast table. She carried it instead to the small, cold room at the top of the servants' stair that had been hers for the 3 years since her parents' deaths. A room with a single narrow window overlooking not the park, but the dairy yard, where the cows she had grown to love more than any drawing-room acquaintance stood steaming in the November frost. She did not know then that the letter in her hands, sealed with a crest her own family had not been permitted to use for over 2 decades, was about to answer a question she had carried, unspoken, since the day her mother died. If you're new to our channel, welcome. We tell the forgotten stories of England's great houses and the women history quietly wrote out of them. Subscribe now, because this story is one worth staying for. And while you're here, tell us in the comments below where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. To understand why a sealed letter could unsettle a young woman so completely, one must first understand what Sophia Wren had lost, and what she had been given in its place in the 3 years since she had come to live at Ashdown Priory. Her mother, Sophia had always been told, was born a lady, a fact whispered rather than spoken plainly, in the careful, half-embarrassed way families speak of relations they would prefer the neighbours forget entirely. Eleanor Ashdown had been the younger sister of the current Duke, raised within these very walls, until the year she turned 20, and did something her family had never forgiven her for. She fell in love with a Devonshire dairy farmer named Josiah Wren, and she married him. Against every objection her father, the old Duke, could raise, and she left Ashdown Priory with nothing but the clothes upon her back and a small wooden trunk she was never, in 20 years, seen to open. Sophia had grown up on that Devon farm, knowing her mother had once lived a grander life, but knowing almost nothing else, not the reason for the family's silence, not the shape of the quarrel that had cost her mother everything, not even the names of the relations who apparently still lived, wealthy and titled, less than 2 days' journey from the farmhouse where Sophia had spent every childhood morning learning, at her mother's careful instruction, the particular art of turning cream into butter. "You have good hands for it," her mother used to say, guiding Sophia's small fingers around the wooden churn with a patience that never once seemed to tire. "Better than mine were, at your age." It is not luck, whatever the fine ladies believe. It is attention. It is patience. It is knowing the cream the way you know a person, when it is ready to become something more than what it was. Sophia did not know then that her mother's particular method, the timing, the temperature, the addition of certain herbs steeped in spring water before the churning even began, was not simply a farmer's wife's inherited habit, but something Eleanor Ashdown had learned, quietly and deliberately, from an old dairywoman at Ashdown Priory itself, decades before, in the very same dairy that Sophia would one day come to inherit. Both her parents were taken by the same winter fever within 11 days of each other when Sophia was 19. The farm, mortgaged more heavily than either parent had ever admitted to their daughter, was sold within the month to settle its debts, and Sophia found herself, for the first time in her life, entirely without a home, and with only one address in England to which she might reasonably write. The Duke of Ashdown, her mother's own brother, a man Sophia had never once met, replied to her letter within a fortnight, offering her a place at Ashdown Priory with the particular chilly formality of a man discharging an obligation he had no genuine wish to honour. She was given a small room at the top of the servants' stair. She was given tasks rather than a place at the family table on most evenings. She was, in the specific and quiet cruelty reserved for poor relations in great houses, treated as neither family nor servant, but as something suspended uncomfortably between the two. She did not know then that her uncle's coldness toward her was not, as she had first assumed, simple indifference to a niece he had never troubled to know. It was something considerably more complicated, a coldness that had been directed, for over 20 years, not truly at Sophia at all, but at the memory of the sister he could not quite bring himself to forgive, and could not quite bring himself to forget either. It was the estate's dairy that first drew Sophia's attention, in her early weeks at the Priory, in much the way a familiar voice draws the ear in an unfamiliar room. The Ashdown dairy had once, according to Mrs. Firth, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for nearly 30 years, produced butter and cheese spoken of with genuine admiration throughout the county. But the old dairywoman who had overseen it for decades had died some years before, and the woman who had succeeded her, a Mrs. Crabbe, had let its standards decline so steadily and so completely that the dairy now produced barely enough passable butter for the household's own table, let alone anything worth selling or serving to guests. Sophia found herself drawn to the dairy yard on quiet mornings, watching through the frosted window of her small room as the cows were led out to pasture, and it was there, on one such morning some 3 weeks into her residence, that Mrs. Crabbe caught her standing at the dairy door, watching the churning with an expression the older woman clearly found impertinent. "This is no place for a young lady, Mrs." Crabbe said sharply, wiping her hands on an apron that had, Sophia noted, gone considerably greyer than any proper dairy apron ought to be. "Best you return to the house, miss, before someone thinks you've taken to wandering where you oughtn't." Sophia did not argue, but she noticed, in the brief glimpse she caught before Mrs. Crabbe ushered her firmly away, that the butter cooling on the marble slabs was pale, soft, and faintly grey at its edges, the unmistakable signs, her mother's old instruction reminded her, of cream churned too warm, too hastily, by hands that no longer took the care the work required. She did not know then that Mrs. Crabbe's carelessness was not, in truth, simple laziness, but something considerably more deliberate, a quiet arrangement maintained for years, by which a significant portion of the estate's dairy produce was sold privately to a merchant in the nearby market town, reported to the household as spoiled or insufficient, while Mrs. Crabbe herself kept the difference in coin that never once appeared in any estate ledger. It was some months later, on a wet afternoon, when the household had confined itself indoors against a persistent autumn rain, that Sophia first raised the matter of the dairy directly with her uncle, a conversation she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks before she found the courage to actually attempt it. She found the Duke in the estate library, a room she rarely entered, its shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes and its walls hung with portraits of ancestors whose stern painted faces seemed, to Sophia, to watch her with the same faint suspicion the living members of the family so often did. "The dairy is producing very little worth the name, Your Grace," she said carefully, when the Duke finally looked up from his correspondence with an expression of mild surprise that his niece had sought him out at all. "I wondered whether I might be permitted to assist Mrs. Crabbe. I was raised on a dairy farm." "I understand the work." The Duke's expression, which had begun as mild surprise, shifted swiftly into something closer to genuine astonishment, and then, just as swiftly, into the particular dismissive amusement Sophia had come to recognize as her uncle's most common response to anything she said. "She has no business running a dairy," the Duke said to his valet later that same evening, in a conversation Sophia was never meant to overhear from the corridor outside his study, though the door had been left carelessly ajar. A farmer's daughter playing at butter churns, imagining she might restore something that requires rather more than sentiment to repair. Let her try if it amuses her. She will tire of it within a season, I have no doubt, and the matter will resolve itself. She did not know then that those words, spoken so carelessly, so certain of their own truth, would become the very thing that steadied her resolve rather than breaking it. She had spent 3 years being treated as an obligation rather than a person. She found, standing in that cold corridor, that she was no longer entirely willing to accept that treatment without at least attempting to prove it wrong. The Duke granted her request, though with such evident lack of confidence that he did not trouble himself to inform Mrs. Crabbe directly, leaving Sophia to negotiate her own uneasy place within the dairy's daily routine as best she could. Mrs. Crabbe, unsurprisingly, resented the intrusion from the very first morning, and made her displeasure known in 100 small, unspoken ways, assigning Sophia the least favourable tasks, offering no instruction beyond what courtesy absolutely required, and watching, with an expression Sophia found increasingly difficult to read, every improvement Sophia quietly began to introduce. She began simply, applying the careful methods her mother had taught her, the precise temperature at which cream ought to be held before churning, the particular rhythm of the churn itself, neither too swift nor too slow, that produced butter of a finer, more even texture than anything the dairy had produced in years. Within a fortnight, even Mrs. Firth, generally sparing with praise, remarked upon the improved quality of the butter now reaching the household's own table. But it was in the estate's old dairy still-room, a small stone chamber attached to the main dairy building, used for little beyond storing empty crocks and broken churns, that Sophia made the discovery that would change the whole shape of what followed. Tucked behind a loose section of shelving, wrapped in oilcloth gone soft and pale with age, was a small wooden trunk. Sophia recognized it instantly, with a jolt that stilled her breath entirely, as the very trunk her mother had carried away from Ashdown Priory over 20 years before, and which Sophia had believed lost, or destroyed, or left behind in the sale of the Devon farmhouse, along with everything else. Someone, her mother, she understood with growing certainty, in the last visit she must have made to this house before her final and complete estrangement from it, had hidden the trunk here deliberately, in the one room at Ashdown Priory no member of the family would ever think to search. Inside the trunk, beneath a scattering of old linens and a single pressed flower gone brittle and colourless with age, Sophia found a journal in her mother's own careful hand, and beneath it a bundle of letters tied with ribbon that had once, judging by its faded remnant of colour, been a deep and vivid blue. The journal began not with any account of scandal or elopement, but with meticulous, loving notes on dairycraft, the same careful attention to cream and churn and timing that Sophia had grown up absorbing without ever fully understanding its origin. Her mother had learnt the art, the early pages revealed, from old Mrs. Winslow, the dairywoman who had served Ashdown Priory for nearly 40 years before her death. A woman who had taken the young lady Eleanor under her wing, not out of any expectation of duty, but because the girl had shown, even as a child of 10, a genuine and unusual love for the work. Mrs. Winslow says, "I have a gift for it," Eleanor had written, in an entry dated some years before her marriage. Father would be horrified to hear it spoken of so plainly, as though it were an accomplishment worth mentioning alongside music or French. But I confess I love the dairy more than any drawing room I have ever been made to sit in, and I do not entirely understand why that should be considered shameful. The later entries, however, told a story considerably darker than any simple romance between a lady and a dairy farmer. Father has arranged a match for me, one entry read, dated the spring of Eleanor's 20th year, with Lord Pelham, a man 43 years my senior, whose first 2 wives, I am told by those willing to speak of it privately, did not survive their marriages to him by any great margin. I have said I will not consent. Father says my consent is not, in the end, strictly required. Sophia's hands stilled over the page, the cold stone room around her, suddenly, very quiet. She did not know then, reading those words for the first time, that her mother's departure from Ashdown Priory had never been the simple, scandalous elopement the family had spent 20 years quietly implying. It had been, in truth, an escape, desperate, deliberate, and considerably more dangerous than any romantic notion of running away with a farmer had ever suggested. The bundle of letters, once Sophia untied the faded ribbon with careful, trembling fingers, confirmed what the journal had only begun to suggest. They were written not by her mother, but to her, in a hand Sophia did not recognize at first, though the signature at the close of each, "Your loving brother," always, whatever father may say, left little doubt as to their author. The current Duke of Ashdown, Sophia's own cold and dismissive uncle, had written to his sister for nearly 2 years after her departure, in secret, in letters that revealed a man entirely unlike the one Sophia had come to know in her 3 years beneath his roof. "I could not stop father from arranging the match," one letter read, dated only weeks after Eleanor's flight from the estate. "But I want you to know that I did try, and that I have never once believed you wrong to refuse it. Father has forbidden any of us from corresponding with you, and has told the household you are dead to this family. I do not believe you are dead to me, whatever I am forced to say in his presence. I hope, wherever you have gone, that you have found the kind of happiness this house was never able to offer you." The letters continued for nearly 2 years, growing gradually shorter, more infrequent, until the final one, dated the same month, Sophia calculated, with a growing ache in her chest, that her own parents had married, ended with words that explained, at last, the full and painful shape of the silence that had followed. "Father has discovered our correspondence," the final letter read. "He says that if I continue it, he will consider me as disloyal to this family as he considers you, and will alter the succession accordingly. I am ashamed to admit that I do not have the courage to risk what that would cost me. I am sorry, Eleanor. I am more sorry than I know how to write. I hope you will forgive me, though I am not certain I deserve it." She did not know then that her uncle's coldness toward her, the very coldness she had spent 3 years quietly resenting, was not indifference to a sister he had never loved, but the visible remnant of a guilt he had carried, silently, for over 20 years, never once finding the courage to address it directly, not even when his sister's own daughter arrived, orphaned, at his door. Sophia did not confront her uncle immediately. She sat with the letters and the journal for several days, in the quiet of her small room, turning over a truth considerably more complicated than the simple scandal she had grown up half believing. But the discovery changed something in her, all the same. Not merely her understanding of her mother's past, but her own resolve regarding the dairy itself. If her mother had loved this work enough to carry its methods with her into a marriage that cost her everything, if Mrs. Winslow's careful teaching had meant enough to Eleanor Ashdown that she preserved it, unspoken. For 20 years of quiet exile, then Sophia understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than overwhelmed her, that restoring the Ashdown dairy was no longer simply a matter of proving her uncle wrong. It was a matter of finishing something her mother had never been permitted to finish herself. Using her mother's journal, its careful notes on cream temperature, on the particular herbs steeped into the wash water, on the exact rhythm of churning that produced butter of an unusually fine and even texture, combined with her own farm-honed skill, Sophia began, over the following months, to transform the Ashdown dairy in earnest, working alongside Mrs. Crabb's younger dairymaids, who proved considerably more willing pupils than their mistress herself. Mrs. Crabb's resentment, meanwhile, curdled into something closer to alarm as the dairy's improved output began, gradually, to draw notice throughout the household and beyond it, an alarm that Sophia would soon discover had rather more urgent cause behind it than simple wounded pride. It was Mrs. Firth, once again, who provided the final piece Sophia needed, this time not through careful gossip, but through simple, practical household accounting that had, until Sophia's arrival, drawn no particular scrutiny from anyone. The dairy's returns have never matched its output, Mrs. Firth admitted one evening, reviewing the household books alongside Sophia at the housekeeper's own quiet insistence. Mrs. Crabbe always said the difference was spoilage. I confess I never thought to question it closely, not until you began producing twice what she ever managed, with half the waste she always claimed was unavoidable. The truth, once Sophia began comparing the dairy's actual production against Mrs. Crabbe's reported figures, with the same careful attention her mother's journal had taught her to bring to cream and churn alike, proved straightforward enough, once properly examined. For years, Mrs. Crabbe had sold a portion of the estate's finest butter and cheese privately to a merchant in the market town. Reporting the produce as spoiled and keeping the proceeds entirely for herself, a small, quiet theft that had gone unnoticed largely because no one at Ashdown Priory had ever cared enough about the dairy's fortunes to look closely. When confronted, gently but plainly, by Sophia in the presence of Mrs. Firth as witness, Mrs. Crabbe did not deny it. She left the estate's employment within the week, and the dairy, at last freed of both her mismanagement and her quiet dishonesty, flourished more fully still under Sophia's careful direction. But it was not the dismissal of Mrs. Crabbe, nor even the dairy's steadily improving fortunes, that brought Sophia at last into the same room as her uncle for the conversation both of them had been avoiding since the day she first found her mother's hidden trunk. She showed him the journal and the letters on an evening in early winter, the first true snow of the season falling silently past the library windows. The fire burned low against the late hour. The Duke read his own youthful letters in silence for a long time, his face, in the firelight, betraying an emotion Sophia had never once seen him permit himself in her presence before. I told myself, for 20 years, he said finally, his voice unsteady, in a way Sophia would not have believed possible 3 years before, that I had done what I could, that father's threat left me no true choice. I have never once, in all that time, fully believed my own excuse, though I have repeated it to myself often enough. She kept your letters, Sophia said quietly. All of them. In the same trunk where she kept Mrs. Winslow's dairy methods. I do not believe she considered you entirely lost to her, whatever your father told the rest of the household. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than on his niece. I dismissed your request to run this dairy, he said finally, with the same careless certainty my own father once used to dismiss your mother's happiness. I did not see the resemblance until this very moment. I am sorry for it, Sophia. I do not know that an apology, after 3 years, or 20, is worth a great deal, but I offer it all the same. It was not, Sophia understood, forgiveness fully realized in a single evening, but it was, unmistakably, the first true step toward it, offered not because the dairy's improved fortunes had forced his hand, but because the truth, once finally spoken aloud, had proven impossible for even a proud man to continue avoiding. Word of the Ashdown dairy's remarkable butter travelled, as such things so often did in the tightly woven world of English country society, through the careful channels of visiting guests and appreciative dinner tables, until it reached, by the early weeks of that winter, the attention of a gentleman connected to the royal household's own provisioning, a man who had tasted, at a neighbouring estate's dinner table, a butter so fine and so distinctly flavoured that he had inquired, with genuine curiosity, after its origin. The request that followed, arriving at Ashdown Priory with considerably more ceremony than the household had grown accustomed to, asked for a regular supply of the estate's dairy produce for consideration at court, a request that threw the household into a flurry of activity entirely unlike anything Sophia had witnessed in her 3 quiet years beneath its roof. By the time the first true snow of winter had settled fully over the Ashdown pastures, the dairy that Sophia's uncle had once dismissed as beneath any serious attention, run by a niece he had declared entirely unsuited to the task, was producing butter spoken of in London drawing rooms Sophia herself would never see, with the same genuine admiration Mrs. Firth remembered from decades before. She did not know then, standing in the dairy yard on that first snowy morning, with her breath visible in the cold air, precisely as she had stood on the morning the letter first arrived, that her mother's careful methods, preserved through 20 years of quiet exile, hidden in a trunk in a forgotten stone room, would one day grace a table considerably grander than any Eleanor Ashdown had ever been permitted to imagine returning to. She knew only that she had finished, at last, something her mother had begun and never been allowed to complete, and that the dairy yard beneath her window, once a place of quiet exile and mismanagement, had become instead the place where she had finally, fully become herself. Spring came again to Ashdown Priory, and with it the dairy Sophia had restored bloomed more fully still, not merely in the quality of its butter, though that remained, by every account, the finest in the county, but in the standing it had earned her within a household that had once treated her as an obligation rather than a person. The Duke, in the months that followed, did what he had never once done in Sophia's 3 years beneath his roof. He had his sister's portrait, removed from the walls of Ashdown Priory over 20 years before and long forgotten in a storage room, brought down and hung once more in the family gallery beside the very ancestors whose painted faces had once seemed, to Sophia, to regard her with suspicion rather than welcome. She deserved better than the silence this family gave her, the Duke said quietly, the first time Sophia found him standing before the restored portrait, and Sophia understood, in that moment, that he was speaking not only of her mother, but, in some quiet and unspoken way, of her as well. Sophia Wren had come to Ashdown Priory 3 years before as an obligation to be tolerated. A farmer's daughter, with hands too accustomed to churns and cream to be considered properly a lady. She had been told, plainly and dismissively, that she had no business running a dairy at all. She did not know, that first cold morning she found the sealed letter waiting in her small room at the top of the servants' stair, that it would lead her not merely to the truth of her mother's exile, but to the quiet, patient restoration of everything that exile had cost, a dairy revived, a family's silence broken, and a place in the world that no one, however loudly they scoffed, could any longer tell her she did not deserve. She knew only, standing each morning now in the dairy yard she had made entirely her own, that some inheritances are not written into any will and are not diminished by however many years of silence stand between the giving and the receiving of them. They wait, patiently, for someone willing enough to finish what was so unjustly left unfinished, and Sophia, at last, had proven herself entirely equal to the task. If Sophia's story moved you the way it moved us while writing it, please subscribe for more forgotten stories from England's great houses, and one last time, let us know in the comments where you watched this from tonight. We'll see you in the next one.